Chapter 4 Mountain-locked ancient temple, forest of hanging corpses. Fu Yao had noticed that Xiao Ying had shrunk into the crowd, and he frowned. Why is there a woman here? While his tone wasn't furious, it didn't mean well either. When Xiao Ying heard him, she bowed her head. Shailian explained. She was worried, so she came here to look. Fu Yao questioned the others. Did you all come up with her? The crowd was a little uncertain at first, but then they replied. Don't remember. Can't tell. No. When we came up, she wasn't here, right? Either way, I didn't see her. Me neither. Xiao Ying quickly said, It's because I was following secretly. Xiao Tu immediately cut her off. Why did you follow in secret? Are you guilty of something? Are you the ghost groom in disguise? With such an accusation, the space near Xiao Ying immediately cleared out, and she waved in a fluster. No, I'm Xiao Ying. I'm real. She turned to Shailian. Young master, we just saw each other. I helped you put on rouge, did your hair, and your whole makeover. Shailian could not find the words to reply to that. Everyone turned their eyes on him, and some started to whisper among themselves. He vaguely heard the words hobby, abnormal, unbelievable, and he cleared his throat. This was a mission requirement. Mission requirement. Nanfeng, Fu Yao, you... Shailian looked around, and only then did he notice that Nanfeng and Fu Yao had been staring at him oddly the entire time. They very rigidly pulled some distance away from him. The way they were staring at him gave him goosebumps from head to toe. Is there something you wish to say to me? How could he have known that this girl's makeover work was so gifted that his brows were shaped elegantly, his face was as fair as jade powder, and his lips were touched with rouge? If he didn't open his mouth, then he was entirely a gentle, demure, and beautiful young lady. This gave the two a huge shock and mired them in disbelief, making them question their lives and feel uncomfortable all over. The face was still the same face, but they no longer knew who they were talking to. Fu Yao turned to Nanfeng. Was there something you wanted to say? Nanfeng immediately shook his head. There's nothing I want to say. Why don't you guys just say something? Shailian asked. Just then, some men from the crowd spoke up. This is the Temple of Mingguang? There's a Temple of Mingguang on this mountain? Amazing! I've never seen it before. The crowd looked over in wonder. Shailian, however, suddenly said, That's right, the Temple of Mingguang. Nanfeng could tell something was off about his tone. What is it? Shailian replied, The north is clearly General Mingguang's territory. It's not like his worship isn't flourishing, so how come there's only one temple of Nanyang at the foot of Mount Yujun? It was easy to understand why the lord official had prayed to the Heavenly Emperor. The Heavenly Emperor was the #1 martial god of the past 1,000 years, and his status was higher than General Mingguang. Naturally, the higher up you prayed, the more guarantee there was. However, General Mingguang and General Nanyang were equal in status, with not much difference. If it must be debated, then General Mingguang possesses 9,000 temples, over 1,000 more than Nanyang, so it was really hard to imagine why they would seek from afar and forego what lay close at hand. Shailian wondered. Technically, even if this Temple of Mingguang on Mount Yujun was overtaken and people couldn't find it, they could have simply built another Temple of Mingguang. Why build the martial temple of another god? Fu Yao could understand. There must be another reason. Right. There must be another reason that would make the people in the Mount Yujun area never build another Temple of Mingguang, Shailian said. Can either one of you lend me a bit more spiritual power? I'm afraid I'll have to go ask. Just then, someone made a commotion. Whoa! There's so many brides! That voice had come from inside the temple, and Shailian whipped around. He told that group to properly stay in the open ground in front of the temple, but they ignored him completely and went in. Nanfeng shouted, The situation's dangerous! Don't run around! However, Xiao Tu rebuked him. Don't listen to him, guys. They won't dare do anything to us. We're good citizens. As if they'd actually dare kill us. Get up, everyone. Get up, get up. He was certain Shailian and company wouldn't actually do anything to them, so he started to riot. Nanfeng cracked his knuckles, looking like he was holding back his curses. As a martial officer of the Palace of Nanyang, how could he break the limbs of mortals whenever he wished? If any supervisory heavenly officials were to report him, it wouldn't be funny. Xiaopeng Tu sneered. Don't think I don't know what you guys are thinking. Aren't you just tricking us into not moving so you can steal the credit and go claim the reward for yourselves? With him egging people on, over half of the group actually started to move, and they ran into the temple along with him. Fu Yao waved dismissively and said apathetically, "Let them be, those unruly people." He sounded extremely disgusted, not wanting to care any more. However, there came a shriek from inside the temple of Mingguang. "They're all dead!" Xiaopeng Tu was also alarmed. All dead? All dead! What is this wickedness? This one looks like she's been dead for decades, but she still hasn't rotted? He quickly got over it, however. Doesn't matter if they're dead. Transport all the corpses of the brides down the mountain. Their families will still have to pay up anyway. Shalian's eyes slowly darkened. The group gave the idea a thought, and it certainly made sense. Some sighed, some grumbled, and there were those who were cheerful again. Shalian stood at the temple entrance. Why doesn't everyone come outside first? The air in the back of this temple is heavy with death. Without any ventilation for years, there'll be issues if you folks were to breathe it in. This sounded very logical, and the group didn't know whether they should listen. Xiaoying begged in a small voice, "Everyone, let's not be this way. It's so dangerous here. Why don't we listen to this young master first and go out to sit?" But this group didn't even bother to listen to Shalian, so why would they listen to her? No one paid attention. Xiaoying didn't give up, however, and repeated herself a few times. Xiaopeng Tu directed them. "Go for the fresh corpses, guys. Who knows if the families of the ones that are too old are still alive? Don't waste your energy hauling those." There were even those who praised him for being clever and able. Shalian really didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this, and when he saw there were people touching where they shouldn't, he warned aloud, "Don't remove the veils. That veil can separate the chi of the corpse and the chi of the living. There's a lot of you, and the living chi is too abundant. If they suck it in, it's hard to know what will happen." However, in order to pick out the freshest corpses, the group of men had already pulled off pretty much all the veils. Shalian exchanged a look with Nanfeng, who had come to the door, and shook his head, knowing they couldn't stop them. After all, it wasn't like they could beat the men to a bloody pulp and render them immobile. Otherwise, if something happened, wouldn't they lose the ability to run? A very hopeless situation. Just then, one of the burly men removed the veil of one of the brides and exclaimed, "My God! This little hussy is super cute." All the men came to surround the corpse. She wasn't even married yet, right? What a waste to just die like that. Her clothes are a bit tattered, but she's the prettiest. This bride probably hadn't been dead for too long. The skin of her face was still rather supple. Someone said, "I dare you to feel her up." "What's there to be scared of?" Xiaopeng Tu said. Then he pinched the corpse's face a couple of times. It was so silky smooth that it made his heart itch, and he reached out, ready to touch her again. Shalian couldn't bear to watch anymore and was about to stop him when Xiaoying rushed over. "Don't do this!" she exclaimed. Xiaopeng Tu gave her a backhand shove and yelled, "Don't get in men's way." But Xiaoying climbed to her feet again and cried, "You're going to incur heaven's wrath like this." Xiaopeng Tu was furious now and he cursed, "God damn it! You ugly freak! You are so nosy!" He swore as he moved to kick her, but Shalian easily lifted the back of Xiaoying's collar with one hand and pulled her away. Unexpectedly, however, they heard a thud. Xiaopeng Tu yelled, "Who hit me?" Shalian looked back. Xiaopeng Tu was bleeding from a gaping wound on the head after having been hit, and there was a blood-stained rock on the ground. Xiaoying was stunned for a moment before quickly apologizing. Sorry, I was scared and I accidentally threw it." However, even if she was eager to take the blame for it, no one would believe her, because the direction was completely wrong. This rock was hurled from a window behind Xiaopeng Tu. When Xiaopeng Tu yelled, everyone had turned to look in that direction, just in time to see a flash of a shadow outside the window. Xiaopeng Tu hollered, "It's him! That ugly freak with bandages on his face!" Shalian stuffed Xiaoying into Nanfeng's hands and strode a couple steps forward. Propping his right hand on the window lattice, he hopped over and ran towards the forest in pursuit. A few of the bolder ones who had their eyes on the bounty followed him and leapt out the window as well. However, when Shalian reached the edge of the forest, he suddenly caught a whiff of blood. Sensing something off, and with alarm bells ringing in his head, he came to a sudden halt. He warned, "Don't go in." He had shouted his warning, but those people thought, "I'll give chase even if you won't," and charged into the forest without stopping. The others, who had originally gathered in the temple, swarmed out too, and when they saw that Shalian stopped at the edge of the woods, those who weren't as bold crowded around to watch. Before long, they heard screams, and a few shadows stumbled out from the forest. They were the few who had barged in first earlier, and now they were staggering out. When the crowd saw them after they stepped under the moonlight, they were instantly scared out of their wits. They were still living humans when they had entered. How did they become blood-soaked humans when they came out? From their faces to the clothes on their bodies, these people were stained with red, the blood gushing forth like a spring. If someone bled this much, it meant certain death. However, those men were still making their way towards them, step by step. Terrified, everyone retreated uniformly until they were behind Shalian. Shalian raised his hand. "Calm down, the blood isn't theirs." Sure enough, those men said, "Yeah, the blood isn't ours. It's... Even when drenched in blood, the horror on their faces could not be concealed. The group followed the eyes of those men and looked into the forest. It was pitch black, so they could not see exactly what lay within. Shalian took over a torch, took a few steps forward, and then raised it to probe ahead. Something in the darkness dripped onto the torch, giving off a sizzling sound. He glanced at the torch before looking up. After composing himself for a moment, he raised his hand and then tossed the torch up. Although the hurled torch only illuminated the area overhead for an instant, everyone still got a clear look of what had been above the trees. Long black hair, deathly pale faces, tattered military officers' uniforms, and arms dangling in the air. The swinging corpses of more than 40 men were suspended upside down at varying heights on the trees. No one knew how long their blood had flowed, but they had yet to dry up. They dripped and dripped, forming a terrifying scene, a forest of hanging corpses amidst a falling rain of blood. This group of people outside the forest were all strong, burly men, but they had never seen such a sight before. They were petrified into silence. When Nanfeng and Fu Yao came over and saw this scene, their expressions froze. After a moment, Nanfeng said, "Green ghost." "Indeed," Fu Yao agreed. "It's his favorite trick." Nanfeng turned to Shalian. "Don't go over there. It'll be a bit of a problem if it's him." Shalian looked back and asked, "Who are you talking about?" "A near supreme," Nanfeng replied. Shalian asked, puzzled. "Near supreme? You mean close to the power level of a supreme?" "That's right," Fu Yao said. "The near supreme green ghost is a malicious creature who has been evaluated by the palace of Lingwen as close to the level of supreme. He adores games like this forest of hanging corpses. You could say he's infamous." Shalian thought, that's really unnecessary. If you're a supreme, you're a supreme. If you aren't, then you aren't. Just like there's only ascended and not ascended, there's no nearly ascended or about to ascend. Adding near only makes it awkward for everyone. He recalled when that young man led him all the way here. There had been the sound of rain pitter-pattering on the surface of his umbrella. Could he have held it up to shield him from the blood rain of this corpse forest? He let out a soft, "Ah," and the other two immediately asked, "What's the matter?" He thus gave a brief account of how he had met a young man while he was in the sedan, and how that young man had brought him here. When he was done, Fu Yao said skeptically, "I noticed the enchanted array on this mountain when I came up. It was immensely tough, but he broke it so handily?" Shalian thought, rather, he crushed it under his heel without even noticing the feat. He said, "That's right, this near supreme green ghost you speak of. Could that be him?" Nanfeng considered it briefly. "I've never seen the green ghost before, so I can't say. Does that young man you saw have any distinctive features?" "Silver butterflies," Shalian said. Earlier, when Nanfeng and Fu Yao saw the forest of hanging corpses, they remained considerably composed. but the instant those two words left Shalian's mouth, he could clearly see the drop in their faces. Fu Yao exclaimed in disbelief. "What did you say? Silver butterflies? What kind of silver butterflies?" Shalian realized he had probably said something significant and explained. "They're like silver, yet also like crystal. They don't seem to be living creatures, but they look quite pretty." He saw Nanfeng and Fu Yao exchange looks with expressions so grim their faces were almost green. After a while, Fu Yao said darkly, "Leave. Right now. We haven't settled the case of the ghost groom yet. How can I leave?" Shalian said. "Settle?" Fu Yao said. He turned back and sneered. "Seems like you have really tarried too long in the human realm. This ghost groom is merely a wrath. Even the green ghost of this hanging corpse forest is merely a near supreme, as pesky as he might be." After another pause, he suddenly said in a stern voice, "Do you know who the master of those silver butterflies is?" Shalian replied honestly, "I don't." "Even if you don't, there isn't time for me to explain now," Fu Yao said stiffly. "In short, he isn't someone you can handle. You'd better hurry back to the heavenly realm and ask for reinforcements." "Then you head back first," Shalian said. "You—" "The master of those silver butterflies never showed any hint of malice," Shalian said. "If he does harbor malice, if he really is as terrifying as you claim, then no one within the perimeter of Mount Yujun would be able to escape his clutches. All the more reason someone has to stand guard here right now. So why don't you go back first and help me seek reinforcements?" He could tell Fu Yao didn't want to remain here and deal with so many troublesome matters. If that was the case, then Shalian wouldn't force the issue. Fu Yao was a straightforward person, so he really did leave on his own, with a toss of his sleeves. Shalian turned towards Nanfeng and was about to inquire further about that young man, when there was another commotion in the crowd. Someone shouted, "We caught him! We caught him!" Now Shalian didn't have time to ask anything more either. "Who did you catch?" Two more bloody figures emerged from the forest. One was a burly fellow who had charged into the forest earlier, and who was one of the few who was not scared off by the blood rain in the corpse forest. The other one was a young boy being dragged along by him in a firm grip, his head and face messily wrapped with bandages. Shalian still remembered what the tea master he had met earlier in the little shop had said. Apparently, the ghost groom is an ugly creature living on Mount Yujun, and because it's so ugly, no woman loves it, which is why it grew hate in its heart and began robbing others of their brides to ruin their happy occasions. They thought that might have been a rumor at the time. Who would have guessed that there really was such a person? Be that as it may, whether he was the ghost groom was a different matter altogether. Shalian was just about to take a closer look at the bandaged boy when Xiaoying rushed over. She yelled, "You've got the wrong person! This isn't the ghost groom! He isn't!" Xiaopeng Tu shouted back. "He was caught red-handed, and you still say he isn't? He paused as if something had suddenly dawned on him. Then he continued, "Oh, I was wondering why you're always acting so strange, always insisting, 'He isn't, he isn't.' So you're in cahoots with this ghost groom." Stunned, Xiaoying hurriedly waved her hands. No, I'm not. He's not either. He hasn't done anything. He's just an ordinary... Xiaopeng Tu pressed on aggressively. "Ordinary what? Ordinary ugly freak?" He yanked at the bandaged boy's hair a couple of times and said, "Then why don't we take a look at how this ordinary ghost groom looks, since he loves stealing others' women so much?" His random grabbing made a mess of a few strips of the bandages, and the bandaged boy instantly held his head and screamed. His cries were full of fear, incredibly mournful and pitiful. Shalian seized Xiaopeng Tu's arm. Enough. When Xiaoying heard that boy's screams, her tears tumbled down, and when she saw Shalian stopping Xiaopeng Tu, it was akin to seeing hope. She hurriedly grabbed his sleeves and begged, Young master, help me! Help him!" Shalian cast her a look, and Xiaoying let go of his sleeves in embarrassment, as if afraid he would scorn her touchy-feely hands and would not want to help her anymore. Shalian comforted her. "It's fine." He took another look at the bloody-headed, bandaged boy and realized that he was also peeking at Shalian with wide, bloodshot eyes through the gaps in the bandages under his hands. The boy only stole a glance before quickly lowering his eyes, and he hurriedly secured the bandages again. Although he did not reveal his face, a patch of skin was exposed, and that bit was already horrifying, as if it had been burned by fire. It was not hard to imagine how scary the face that laid underneath the bandages was, and the others sucked in breath while the boy shrank even more. Shalian noticed that the way those two cowered was exactly the same. It was as if they were afraid to step into the light, afraid to see other people. He sighed inwardly. Next to them, Xiaopeng Tu was alarmed. "What are you scheming? We are the ones who caught the ghost groom." Shalian let go of him. "I'm afraid the ghost groom won't let you catch him so easily. My friend searched around here earlier, and he didn't find him. It's possible this boy came much later. The real ghost groom should still be here." Xiaoying also mustered up her courage. "You want the reward money, but you can't just catch anyone at random and make up the numbers." Xiaopeng Tu clearly wanted to hit her again after hearing this. He had been causing trouble since earlier, and Shalian finally couldn't endure it anymore. He waved his hand, and Roya flew out to give Xiaopeng Tu a slap with a thwack that knocked him over. Nanfeng seemed to have reached his limit too, and immediately followed up with a kick. The youth finally toppled to the ground and remained still. This person was the lead instigator, so once he became immobile, the crowd didn't know who to take aim at and settled down. There were a few scattered outcries here and there, but the commotion was over. Shalian thought, "Finally, we can get down to business." He sized up the young boy on the ground for a moment, then asked, "Were you the one who threw the rock in the window earlier?" His voice was gentle. The bandaged boy, who was trembling uncontrollably, peeked at him again and nodded. Xiaoying explained, "He doesn't want to harm anyone. He just wanted to help me when it looked like Xiaopeng Tu was going to hit me." Shalian asked the boy again, "Do you know what's with all these corpses hanging in the forest?" Xiaoying answered, "I don't know what's going on, but he's definitely not the one who hung them up." The bandaged boy trembled non-stop, but all he did was shake his head repeatedly. Nanfeng, who had been staring at him, suddenly said, "Who is the green ghost Qi Rong to you?" Shalian gave a slight start on hearing this name. The bandaged boy, however, just looked blank. He showed no reaction when the name was uttered, and he was too scared to reply to Nanfeng. He's too scared to talk," Xiaoying explained. All this while, she had been trying her best to protect this strange boy. Shalian implored gently, "Miss Xiaoying, what exactly is the matter with this child? Tell me everything you know." Xiaoying seemed to summon up a little courage at the sight of Shalian. Firelight shone brightly on her face, but she was no longer avoiding it. Wringing her hands, she said, "He really didn't do anything bad. This child simply lives on Mount Yujun. Sometimes, when he's too hungry, he'll run down the mountain to steal some food. There was once when he happened to steal from my house. I saw that he couldn't really talk, and there were injuries on his face, so I found some cloth for him to bandage himself with. I'd also give him food sometimes." Shalian had initially thought them to be a couple, but now that he learned all of this, Xiaoying's reciprocal protectiveness was more like that of an older sister, or even an elder taking care of him. She added, "Later, there were many who thought he was the ghost groom. I couldn't convince them, so I could only hope that the real culprit would be quickly captured. I thought, since you're so capable, prepared to act as a bride to catch the ghost groom and everything, then at the very least you wouldn't catch the wrong person, because he would never, ever hijack the wedding sedan. But the moment I headed out, I heard that Xiaopeng Tu and the rest wanted to search the mountain today too. I was really worried, so I secretly came up to take a look." She stood as a shield before the boy like she was afraid the others would hit him again, and defended him further. "He really isn't the ghost groom. Look at him. It's taken so few to beat him like this. How in the world could he defeat so many military officers escorting the bride sedan?" Shalian and Nanfeng exchanged glances, both equally finding this to be a headache. If it was as she said, then wasn't the boy completely unrelated to this incident? The bandaged boy, the Wrath Ghost Groom, the near supreme green ghost, and that powerful, influential master of the silver butterflies who made all heavenly officials turn pale at the mere mention of his name. To think this small Mount Yujun would see a never-ending flow of strange guests. This was truly a tough case to deal with. Who was who? What was the relationship between who and who? Shalian felt his headache intensify several times over. He rubbed his forehead and temporarily stopped thinking about how much truth there was in Xiaoying's words. Something else suddenly came to mind that he'd been meaning to ask, and he said, "Miss Xiaoying, have you always lived near Mount Yujun?" Xiaoying replied, "Yes, I've always lived here. I can guarantee that he's never done anything bad here." "No, I wanted to ask you something else," Shalian said. "Are there no other temples of Mengguang built in the vicinity of Mount Yujun, other than the one on the mountain?" Xiaoying was taken aback. She thought about it, then said, "There should have been others, I think." At her response, Shalian suddenly had the vague feeling that he'd grasped something important. He asked, "Then why did I only see a temple of Nanyang at the foot of the mountain, but not a temple of Mengguang?" Xiaoying scratched her head. "They tried to build one before, but I heard that every time construction of a temple of Mengguang was in the works, there would always be a fire for some reason halfway through. Some people said that it probably meant General Mengguang would not protect this place for some reason, so they switched to General Nanyang." Nanfeng noticed Shalian's frozen expression and asked, "What's the matter with you?" Shalian suddenly realized that it was all too simple. The brides who could not smile, the temple that caught fire for no reason, the temple of Mengguang locked away by the enchanted array in the mountains, the majestic martial god statue of General Pei, the ghost groom who had disappeared into thin air after being wounded by Roya. All too simple. It was only because there was always something else interfering and diverting his attention that he hadn't realized such a simple truth right from the start. He forcefully seized hold of Nanfeng and exclaimed, "Lend me some spiritual powers." Nanfeng was startled but hurriedly struck a palm with him in midair. He asked, "What's the matter?" Shalian dragged him and ran. "I'll explain later. Think of a way to subdue the corpses of those 18 brides first." Nanfeng said, "Have you lost your senses? There are only 17 brides' corpses. You are the 18th. Shalian said, No. He explained, "There were only 17 before, but now there are 18. Among the 18 brides' corpses, one is fake. The ghost groom is hiding among them." The two dashed back to the temple of Mengguang. However, the back of the great hall was already completely empty. There was only a pile of messily strewn red veils where the brides stood earlier. Seeing this sight, Shalian cried mentally, this is bad, darn it! He quickly picked up the veils on the ground. After he did so, he heard alarmed cries coming from outside the temple. The two looked out the window and saw that a mob of women in scarlet wedding dresses had formed a circle and were slowly closing in on the group of villagers. Each of the women had a pale, greenish face wearing a smile, her arms raised straight out. They were the corpses of the brides from earlier. No one could remain calm while watching helplessly as they slowly closed in. The crowd didn't care to accost that bandaged boy anymore and fled. Xiaoying immediately rushed over to support him. Shalian called out helplessly, "Don't run!" He had lost count how many times he'd said that tonight. Whenever something happened, he'd have to say it at least 30 to 40 times, yet there was always someone ignoring him. What a helpless affair. He waved his hand and the silk band Roya flew out towards the sky. He made a casual hand sign, and Roya began whirling in the air on its own, like the mad dance of a celestial being, incredibly eye-catching. When those brides saw that there was something over this way, lively and spinning rapidly with its tail whipping at them, a good number of them were lured over. There were also 7 that were attracted to the scent of blood in the deep of the forest, so they slowly hopped in that direction. Shalian exclaimed, "Follow them, Nanfeng! Don't let them go down the mountain!" He didn't need to worry. Nanfeng had already gone off to chase them. 2 of the brides came and attacked in Shalian's direction, their fingers bright red, their nails sharp. Shalian took out the red veils he had collected off the ground earlier and hurled them out with both hands. 2 of the veils spun as they shot out, squarely covering the heads of those 2 brides. Instantly, their movements stalled. As expected, when the heavy, bright red veils covered the eyes and the noses of those corpses, they could no longer see the shadows of mortals, nor smell their scent. and since their dead bodies were stiff, they couldn't bend their own arms to remove the veils. They could only grab randomly at the air with their extended arms, as if they were playing blind man's bluff. This was truly both a horrifying and silly sight. Shalian stood in front of them and tentatively waved his hand in front of the two brides' eyes, and when he saw that they were grabbing cluelessly in another direction, he contemplated for a moment. But in the end, he still couldn't help but say, "Please forgive my impropriety," before seizing their arms and placing their claws on each other's necks. When the two brides suddenly felt something in their hands, their bodies shook, and since they couldn't see anything, they started strangling each other viciously. Shalian then quickly ran off with a wide wave of his hand, and Roya followed him like a streak of white rainbow before landing on the ground to form a large white circle. Shalian called after the people who were fleeing in all directions, "Everyone, get into the circle!" The group hesitated as they ran, but Xiaoying immediately helped the bandaged boy over to stand inside. After some thought, she ran out again and dragged Xiaopeng Tu, who was passed out on the ground, into the circle as well. Right then, one of the brides hopped to the edge of the white circle, and her claws shot out to grab for them. Yet, it was as if there were a transparent wall that forcibly divided the space. Xiaoying noticed the bride couldn't hop in no matter what she tried, and quickly shouted, "Everyone, come in, quick! They can't enter this circle!" When the men saw this, they hurried back like a swarm of bees. Thankfully, Shalian had Roya burst into a great length beforehand, and the circle was big enough. Otherwise, he would be worried there would be people squeezed out because it was too cramped. The brides couldn't hop into the circle and knew they couldn't do anything to this group, so they uniformly spun around and, shrieking, lunged in Shalian's direction. However, Shalian was already waiting for them, and from his sleeve he pulled out a large bundle of veils. The many red cloths in his hands spun up, down, left, and right, flying in all directions, both his hands and feet moving non-stop, covering each one as they came, swift and precise. With every bride veiled, the bride would begin to slow and feel around like a blind person. The veils in his hands were spun to blurs as they were thrown with ease, forming countless red silhouettes flying through the air. The people inside the circle actually started cheering in spite of themselves. "Nice! Amazing! So amazing! You trained for this, right?" When Shalian heard them, he blurted out of habit, Thank you! Please support my act with money if you have the means, or with applause if you haven't." Wait. He only noticed something wrong after the words left his lips. He'd gotten caught up and let slip the speech he used to say when he busked, and hurriedly stopped himself. While he was talking, several more brides jumped up. Jumps that were surprisingly over 2 meters high and 10 meters long, and in the span of a second, the stench of rot came before his nose. Shalian pushed off with the tip of his foot, his body sweeping past them, and while in the air, he mentally chanted the verbal password to a certain private communication array. Ling Wen the All-Knowing, I have a question. Do you know if the Martial God of the North, General Ming Guang, had any intimate female friends? Ling Wen's voice rang in his ear. Your Highness, why do you ask? I've got a bit of a situation here right now. Kind of urgent, Shalian said. Not gonna lie, there are a dozen dead people chasing me right now. Huh? That awful? Ling Wen was shocked. Not too horrible, Shalian said. So, did he? I know this question is more personal in nature, and it's not easy to answer, which was why I didn't ask in the general communication array. It's necessary for the mission, and the information will never be divulged. You've misunderstood, Your Highness, Ling Wen replied. It's not that this question isn't easy to answer. It's that Old Pei really has had too many intimate female friends. Your question is so sudden, I don't know which one you're referring to at the moment. Shalian almost slipped in his step. All right. Then, among General Pei's female friends, is there one who is possessive, extremely jealous, and has some form of disability? Now that you've mentioned it, I do recall someone, Ling Wen replied. Shalian sent 2 more veils flying, causing another round of applause, and he spun around, cupping his hands at the audience in thanks. Tell me, Ling Wen began. Before Old Pei ascended, he was a general. He became involved with the female general of an enemy state on the battlefield, someone extremely beautiful and fierce in character. Her name was Xuanji. Okay, Xuanji, Shalian acknowledged. Ling Wen continued. General Pei is someone who... When he sees a beautiful woman, he'll have to go and entangle himself, even if there's a blade to his throat. This woman led an army and crossed swords with him, and she was defeated. Xuanji became a prisoner of war and was taken to the enemy camp. While the guards weren't paying attention, she was planning to end her life on the spot, but she did not succeed. A general cut her verdant sword in half with one swing of his blade and saved her. And this dashing General Pei of the enemy state was the General Mingguang who later ascended. As for this General Pei, 1. He was always someone who cherished beauties, and 2. The result of the war was already determined. So even if the fighting dragged on, the situation was already impossible to flip, and so Xuanji was released. However, with all this frequent contact and back and forth, it was easy to imagine what would come of it. Just then, one of the brides caught Shalian's leg and dug her fingers in, almost sinking her claws into his flesh. He wanted to kick out at first, but realized at this angle he could only kick her face. Well, you can't hit a lady's face, Shalian thought, so he changed his position and kicked her shoulder instead, while sending another veil flying. Sounds like a beautiful tale. It was a beautiful tale at first, Ling Wen said, but what killed it was that Xuanji was adamant about being General Pei's lover for the rest of his life. Shalian ran a couple of steps and leapt, scaling up the roof, then looked down at the 5 or 6 brides who continued to close in on him down below. He wiped away his sweat. There isn't anything wrong for a woman to want to be the only lover in a lifetime. There isn't, Ling Wen said, but when 2 countries clash, the battlefield is heartless. Those 2 had originally agreed willingly that this was going to be a short-lived affair, that today would exist, but not tomorrow, and to speak only of romance and not of war. But with someone like old Pei, I'll be honest, it's already pretty good if he doesn't cheat on you. However, Xuanji was a dignified lady general and intense in temperament. If it was something she wanted, she'd clutch on firmly, without ever letting go. Hold on, Shalian interrupted. Tell me first, is Xuanji disabled, and how so? It's her... Ling Wen's voice abruptly came to a stop. For goodness sakes, every time, when he got to the most important part, the bit of spiritual power he'd borrowed would run out. It seemed next time he'd have to get straight to the point right from the start. In between flying and jumping, Shalian rapidly reorganized his thoughts. If the bandaged boy wasn't the ghost groom, and this group of villagers had also confirmed that the ghost groom wasn't among them, then the only place left to hide was among the 17 brides. When Shalian snuck into the fold, the ghost groom couldn't immediately tell that the numbers were wrong. On the flip side, when the ghost groom mixed in with the brides, Shalian also couldn't tell there was an extra corpse at a single glance. Now that he thought about it closely, after the silk band Roya had injured the ghost groom, he only saw a ball of black mist stealing for the forest. But he couldn't say for sure that the ball of black mist contained a person. What probably actually happened was that when he rushed out of the temple entrance to give chase, the ghost groom remained in the temple, full of black mist, brushing past him and returning to the back of the hall, hiding itself like a leaf among the trees and mixing in with the corpses of the brides. Then the ghost groom wasn't a groom, but a bride, a woman dressed in a wedding dress. Since it was a woman, many things could now be explained. For example, why there was no Temple of Mingguang on or around Mount Yujun. It wasn't that the locals didn't want to build the temples, it was because they couldn't. Xiaoying had said, I heard that every time construction of a Temple of Mingguang was in the works, there would always be a fire for some reason halfway through. This didn't sound like a coincidence at all. It could be nothing but arson. Why set fires to burn temples? Under normal circumstances, it would happen because of hatred. So then why would there be a Temple of Mingguang on Mount Yujun that was locked within an enchantment to keep out visitors? Yet the maintenance and the craft work of the divine statue within the temple were so exquisite. Why was the ghost bride all decked out in a wedding dress herself, but couldn't bear to see other brides in wedding dresses smile when passing through Mount Yujun? When every dot was connected, Shalian couldn't think of any answer besides jealousy and possessiveness, and that odd sound, like cloth-covered rods dragging something heavy. If it was truly the sound of footsteps, then Shalian could only think of one possibility. Every bride that was chasing him had been veiled. Shalian finally landed back on the ground, let out a light sigh, steadied himself, and then straightened up to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 10... 7 brides had hopped into the forest, and Nan Feng had gone to chase them. He veiled 10 brides, and they were all here. That meant there was one more who hadn't shown her face. Right then, he heard that familiar sound of thump, 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 coming from behind him. Shalian slowly turned around, and an extremely short, small form entered his field of vision. He drew in a small breath and thought, I knew it. This short, small woman before his eyes was dressed in red wedding robes, but there was no air of joy, only sorrow. The reason she was short wasn't because that was her natural stature, but because she was kneeling on the ground. The bones of both of her legs were broken, but the legs remained, and she had been using her knees to walk all this time. The odd thump-thump sound he heard was the sound of her dragging her 2 broken legs to hop across the ground. That female ghost bore a handsome oval face, her brows high and arching. She was truly exceedingly beautiful. No wonder the men had spoken of her so much before. While her beauty was initially laced with 3 parts heroism, it was now stormy with resentment, as if she had been trapped in a small confined space for years, barred from the light of the sun. She was kneeling on the ground, and the bridal robe was tattered and frayed below the knees. Shalian and the ghost stared at each other unyieldingly for a while before he spoke up. Xuanji? It seemed like it had been many years since anyone called her by that name. It was a long time before the resentment on her face quietly faded some, and a flash of light shone in her eyes. Was it he who sent you to find me? She asked. Shalian supposed that this he naturally referred to General Pei. Xuanji then pressed on. What about the man himself? Why won't he come see me? That passionate expression and hopeful tone while she spoke made Shalian feel that he'd best not say he didn't. Seeing that he hesitated to respond, Xuanji slumped to the ground. Her back leaned against that handsome, tall, martial god statue. Her bright red bridal robe spread around her on the ground like a giant flower of blood. Her hair was disheveled, and her face filled with agonizing torment, as if she was suffering from extreme misery. Why won't he come see me? Shalian couldn't answer this question either, so he could only remain silent. Xuanji raised her head to gaze upon that divine statue and moaned sorrowfully. Pei dear, oh Pei dear, I've betrayed my kingdom for you, abandoned my everything and become like this. Why won't you come see me anymore? She pulled at her own hair, demanding, Could your heart be made of iron? Shalian didn't react to any of this, but when he heard her, he silently pondered. Xuanji said she betrayed her kingdom for General Pei. Could that mean that this General Pei she spoke of cajoled her into divulging enemy secrets while the two were in the heat of their passion, causing Xuanji's kingdom to fall into a disadvantage on the battlefield? She also said that it was because of General Pei that she'd become like this, and by this she naturally meant this tragic, broken-legged form. Xuanji was a female general. Upon the battlefield, there was no way she would be disabled, so those legs of hers could only have been broken later. Could that have something to do with General Pei too? Was it General Pei deserting what he had started that led to such deep and severe resentment? Shalian felt everything he thought of was rather vulgar. However, with Xuanji having such profound resentment to the point where she was harming innocent lives, as vulgar as it was, Shalian could only force himself to think in that direction. Just then, the sound of a girl screaming suddenly came from outside the temple. Help! Help! Shalian and Xuanji both looked out of the window at the same time. Where Roya had formed the white circle, a man was trying to drag that bandaged boy out, while Xiaoying clung to the man's leg, not letting go. The man started yelling curses. It was Xiaopeng too. Fuck off! You dumbass! What if you call that female ghost over? Xiaoying shouted. If she comes, she comes. You're scarier than any ghosts. I'd rather see a female ghost instead. Turned out that Xiaopeng too, who Shalian had knocked out with one whip of his silk band, had come too. When he saw the sluggishly fumbling brides all around, he first jumped in surprise, but soon realized none of them could detect humans. He was exceedingly gutsy, hot-headed, and foolhardy, and he planned to drag the bandaged boy down the mountain to collect his bounty while no one else dared to move. He didn't care at all whether or not this boy was really the ghost groom. Everyone down the mountain said he was, so he was. Yet, unexpectedly, Xiaoying pounced over, screaming and shouting, alerting all the drifting brides in the surrounding area, including Xuanji inside the temple of Mingguang. Shailian saw that it was him again, and mentally grumbled that he should have whipped harder earlier. Best if the man was whipped so hard he didn't wake for 3 days and 3 nights. He shouted, "Go back into the circle!" Xiaopeng Tu saw that a stream of black mist had come lunging at him, and hastily retreated. However, the bandaged boy was still in his grip, and Xiaoying was still clinging to his leg, so in the end, he was still too slow by a beat. Instantly, the black mist enveloped him, and he was then sucked back into Xuanji's hand. He turned his head to look. Wasn't this disheveled, long-haired, haunting, chilling woman the beautiful corpse he had touched among all those brides lying on the ground earlier? It wasn't until that moment that he finally learned what fear meant. He shrieked at the top of his lungs while Xuanji curled her 5 fingers, digging them deep into the back of his head. In an instant, his skull was pulled out through the heavy layer of flesh on his scalp. The skull that was just pulled out was still steaming hot, its mouth still wide open and screaming, "Ah!" The people within the white circle also had their mouths open wide and screaming, so terrified that their souls had left their bodies. "Ah!" Xiaoying was also thoroughly terrified, pulling the bandaged boy into the circle as she screamed. Xuanji reached her fingers out at them again, but Shailian dashed over and blocked her. "General, please refrain from committing further murderous sins." He called her General in hopes of reminding her that she was once a heroine who fought bravely on the front lines to protect her kingdom. Yet Xuanji crushed the head that was still screaming in terror in her grip, that gorgeous face now 7 parts twisted. She sneered, "Is he too scared to see me?" Shailian couldn't think of any other way, so he wondered if he could pretend to be someone sent by General Pei to smooth things over first. But Xuanji didn't need his response at all. She laughed heartily and whipped around, pointing at the divine statue. "I burned your temples and caused havoc in your land, just so you'd come to take one look at me. I've waited for you for years." She stared at that martial god statue in a long trance, then suddenly leapt up, strangling its neck and shaking it like mad. "But you still won't come to see me? Is it because you know you wronged me? Won't you look at my legs? Look at how I am now. This is all for you. For you. Is your heart made of iron?" As a bystander, Shailian didn't want to comment on who was right or wrong, but in his opinion, he really couldn't help but think, if you wanted to see him, could you not have used a saner method? In any case, if someone did all this because they wanted to see me, I would have 0 desire to show up. On the other end, Xiaoying and that bandaged boy finally returned to the circle anew. Looking this way, she whispered in concern, "Young master." Hearing her, Shailian gave her a smile, indicating that she needn't worry. Yet, unexpectedly, the moment he smiled, Xuanji's face instantly contorted, and she lunged over from the divine statue. "Since you won't look at me, and prefer to look at those girls who love smiling, I'll let you look to your heart's content." Although the one she was strangling was Shailian, her words were directed at General Pei. At first, Shailian had thought that Xuanji's heart was full of jealousy for those happily smiling brides in their stands, because she herself couldn't marry the one she loved. He hadn't expected that it was because this General Pei liked girls who smiled, so she, in her distorted mind, connected that to brides who were about to marry their lovers. No wonder she burned all the Mingguang temples around the mountain. Now that he thought about it, it was probably because she couldn't stand having to share this one divine statue with all those women who'd visit Mingguang's temples day in and day out. This female ghost was indeed a wrath. Even with both legs broken, her movements were fast as a devil's, and even after being beaten by Roya, her strength was still formidable. Shailian couldn't keep going with her strangling him like this, but just as he was about to summon Roya, there was a loud cry. "Ah!" That girl Xiaoying saw that he couldn't hang on anymore, so she picked up a branch and came charging over. She was yelling as she charged, seeming to pump up courage for herself, but Xuanji didn't even need to lift a finger. She only gave a chilling look and before Xiao Ying had even gotten close, she was sent flying meters away and crashed heavily onto the ground head first. The bandaged boy croaked out loud, "Ah!" as he ran over. Shay-Lian was shocked too, but right as he sat up, he felt a chill on the back of his head. Xuanji's 5 fingers were already in place, like she was going to yank his skull from his skin just like earlier. In this dire situation, Shay-Lian's right hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. He shouted, "Bind!" A sharp whoosh sound echoed through the air, and the white silk bandage heeded the command, circling and twisting about Xuanji, trussing her up. Xuanji's legs were broken, so she couldn't dodge in time. Thus, with a heavy thud, she fell to her knees and started rolling on the ground, trying to break free of the white silk band. Yet, the more she struggled, the tighter the bindings became. The instant he was set free, Shay-Lian didn't even take a moment to catch his breath before he immediately got to his feet and ran to where Xiao Ying landed. Even with Roya having been recalled, most of the crowd still didn't dare to move rashly, but there were also a number of daring villagers who'd gotten used to those fumbling brides and went circling. The bandaged boy was kneeling next to Xiao Ying's sprawled form, not knowing what to do. So anxious he was just like a small insect on the rim of a boiling pot. No one dared touch her, afraid that she had broken something critical, and if she should struggle, the injury could worsen. Shay-Lian gave a quick once-over, and knew that no matter how careful he was, it'd be pointless. There was no way she'd survive after such a fall. While he hadn't interacted much with this girl Xiao Ying, hadn't even spoken with her much, Shay-Lian still knew that she was a kind-hearted girl, despite her ugly appearance. Such an ending for her truly made the heart heavy. At least Xuanji shouldn't be able to struggle free of Roya. Shay-Lian thought, even if it's pointless, Xiao Ying shouldn't be left in this position right before her death, and so he very carefully flipped her over. Xiao Ying's face was covered in blood, and the crowd around clicked their tongues and sighed as they watched. However, she still had breath left, and she whispered, "Young master, have I made things worse?" Although she didn't make anything worse, she didn't actually help either. Shay-Lian was already going to summon Roya at the time, and didn't require anyone else's help. Besides, with that single branch of hers, even if she managed to hit Xuanji, it wouldn't have done anything. Never mind that she wouldn't have been able to get near the female ghost's body in the first place. With all that, this could be said to be a completely meaningless death. Shay-Lian answered, "No, you've been a great help. You see, the moment you came over, the female ghost's attention was diverted, which was how I had the chance to subdue her. Thank you so very much, but you can't do that again next time, alright? If you're going to help, you have to tell me first. Otherwise, if I don't pick up on it, things will go downhill fast." Xiao Ying chuckled. "Young master, you don't need to comfort me anymore. I know I wasn't any help, and that there won't be a next time." Her words were jumbled and unclear, and when she spat out a mouthful of blood, there were even a few broken front teeth mixed in. That bandaged boy was shaking with panic, woo-wooing, trying to speak. Xiao Ying turned to him. "In the future, don't go down the mountain to steal food anymore. If you're discovered, you'll be beaten to death." "If he ever gets hungry, he can come to me," Shay-Lian said. Xiao Ying's eyes lit up hearing this. "Really? Then thanks so much." She smiled and smiled until suddenly 2 lines of tears streamed down from that pair of tiny eyes. She whispered, "I feel like I haven't lived through many good days in all my life here in this world." Shay-Lian didn't know what to say, so he gently patted her head. Xiao Ying then sighed. "Never mind, maybe I'm just born unlucky." Her jumbled words certainly did sound a little odd. With a bent nose and slanted eyes, and an appearance so ugly it was silly, her bloodied, tear-streaked face was almost funny to behold. With tears still rolling down, she choked. "But even then, I still... Her breathing stopped, and she passed with those words. The bandaged boy saw that she had died, and started to weep quietly while hugging her dead body. His face was buried in her belly like he had lost his only pillar of support, and he didn't dare to raise his head no matter what. As for Shay-Lian, He reached out and helped close her eyes. He spoke to her mentally. "You're stronger than me." Right then, the sound of a bizarre bell tolled. Clang, clang, clang. 3 booming tolls, and all of a sudden, Shaylien felt his head go dizzy. He wondered out loud, "What's going on?" Then he looked all around. All the brides had collapsed to the ground, only their arms still up and reaching towards the sky. The crowd of villagers was also slumped, as if they were all knocked out by the sound of the deafening bells. Shaylien himself felt his head become rather heavy, and though he forced himself to stand with his hands supporting his forehead, his legs went weak and he fell with one knee to the ground. Fortunately, someone helped support him. When Shaylien looked up, it was Nanfeng. Turned out, the moment those 7 brides entered the forest, they immediately spread out. Nanfeng had run all over the entirety of Mount Yujun before he managed to capture all of them, and had only just returned. Seeing him quite calm, Shaylien immediately asked, "What's with that bell?" "Don't worry, it's reinforcements," Nanfeng replied. Shaylien looked over, following his gaze. Only then did he notice that, before the Temple of Mingguang, a row of soldiers had appeared, standing there since who knew when. These soldiers were outfitted in armor, emitting sharp and awe-inspiring auras, and their bodies were enveloped in a thin sheen of spiritual light. In front of the soldiers there stood a poised, elegant, and tall young military general, obviously not a mortal. That military general approached with his hands clasped behind his back and came before Shaylien, bending slightly at the waist, giving a quick bow. "Your Highness?" Shaylien hadn't yet opened his mouth to make inquiries before Nanfeng whispered next to him, "This is General Pei." Shaylien instantly took a glance at Xuanji, who was on the ground. General Pei? This General Pei didn't quite match what he had imagined, and was also grossly different from the divine statues. That divine statue's heroic form was vivacious, its eyes spirited and energetic, with a handsomeness that was aggressive and invasive. While this young military general was also handsome, his complexion was pale, and his countenance was calm as cool jade. There was no sense of a murderous aura, only an unrippled tranquility. He was a military general, but he could also be said to be a tactician. General Pei noticed Xuanji on the ground and spoke. "The Palace of Lingwen informed us that this incident at Mount Yujun might be related to our Palace of Mingguang, and so this servant has come. I didn't expect that it really did have something to do with us. We have troubled your Highness." Shaylien thanked Lingwen mentally. He wondered, how in the world was the Palace of Lingwen inefficient? He replied, "General Pei is working too hard." Xuanji, who was still vaguely struggling, heard the words General Pei and suddenly looked up. She demanded enthusiastically, "Pei dear? Pei dear, is that you? Have you come? Have you finally come?" She was bound by Ruoya, and as overjoyed as she was, she could only rise to a kneel. Yet, unexpectedly, her face immediately blanched the moment she saw that military general. "Who are you?" On this end, Shaylien had already given Nanfeng a general account of just what the Ghost Groom affair was about. When he heard her, he wondered, isn't this General Pei? Could she have waited for too long and doesn't recognize him anymore? "This is General Pei," Nanfeng answered, "but it's not the one she's waiting for." Shaylien was confused. "And there are 2 Generals Pei?" Yet Nanfeng replied, "That's correct. There are indeed 2 of them." Turned out the General Pei this female ghost Xuanji was waiting for was the main god of the Temple of Mingguang. The one before them now was the deputy god of the Palace of Mingguang, a descendant of the senior General Pei. In order to differentiate between the two, everyone addressed this one as General Pei Jr. In legitimate Mingguang temples, both must be worshipped, one facing the front and one facing the back. General Pei was the principal god of the main hall, so his divine statue faced the entrance of the temple hall, whereas General Pei Jr.'s divine statue was set up behind. While he was of a later generation than his ancestor, by the looks they appeared no different than brothers. Two ascendees from one household was certainly considered a beautiful tale. Xuanji scanned the area and didn't see the one she wanted to see among the soldiers either. She cried bitterly, "Where's Pei Ming? Why hasn't he come? Why won't he come and see me?" General Pei Jr. inclined his head and replied, "General Pei has important business to tend to." Xuanji muttered, "Important business?" Tears streamed beneath the long hair draped over her face. "I've waited for him for hundreds of years. What important business could he have? Back then, in order to see me, he would cross half the border in one night. So what important business could he have now? So important that he can't even come down to spare me a glance? Is there something important? I don't think there is." "General Xuanji, please be on your way," General Pei Jr. said. From the troop, two soldiers of the palace of Mingguang approached and pulled Roya from Xuanji's person. After it affectionately wrapped itself back around Shailian's wrist, he gently patted it twice to comfort it. Xuanji allowed herself to be grabbed by those two soldiers, briefly dazed before she suddenly started struggling with force, cursing while pointing to the heavens. "Pei Ming, I curse you!" This screech was sharp, and Shailian was taken aback, thinking to himself, "Isn't this cursing the ancestor in front of the descendant?" General Pei Jr., however, didn't react at all. He said impassively, "Please excuse us." Xuanji screamed until she went hoarse. "I curse you! You'd best never fall in love with anyone. Otherwise, if that day should come, I'll curse you to be just like me, to burn with the fire of love unceasingly forever and ever. The fire of love will burn your body, scorch your heart and your insides." Right then, General Pei Jr. greeted Shailian and the others. "Excuse us, please wait a moment." Then he raised his middle and index finger and lightly pressed them against his temple. This was the spell to activate the spiritual communication array, so he had to be communicating with someone. A moment later he ummed and dropped his hand, clasping it behind him again, and turned to Xuanji. "General Pei wants me to tell you that's impossible." Xuanji screeched, "I curse you!" General Pei Jr. waved his hand slightly and ordered, "Take her away." The two soldiers carried Xuanji, who was struggling like crazy, and dragged her off. Shailian spoke up. "General Pei Jr., might I ask, how will Xuanji be handled?" "Sealed under a mountain," General Pei Jr. replied. To use a mountain as a seal was certainly the usual way the Heavenly Realm dealt with monsters and ghosts. After a brief moment of hesitation, Shailian continued, "General Xuanji's resentment is quite strong. She couldn't let go of the hatred that stemmed from betraying her kingdom for General Pei. Perhaps sealing isn't the right long-term solution." General Pei Jr., however, only inclined his head. "She said she betrayed her kingdom because of General Pei?" "She certainly did say so," Shailian said, "and that it was because of General Pei that she became like this. Whether that's the truth, though, I don't know." "If it must be said that way, it's not altogether wrong," General Pei Jr. said. "She did betray her kingdom for General Pei. However, the details might be different from what bystanders might imagine. After she and General Pei separated, in order to keep him, General Xuanji offered up military intelligence of her own volition. General Pei was unwilling to win unfairly, so he didn't take the offer. Well now, he never expected that the whole 'I betrayed my kingdom for you' thing was actually something like that." Shailian replied, "Then, when she said both of her legs being broken was also because of General Pei, it was—" "She broke those legs herself," General Pei Jr. answered. "Broke them herself?" General Pei Jr. replied emotionlessly, "General Pei doesn't like forceful women, but General Xuanji has a strong character, which was why they couldn't be together for long. General Xuanji couldn't accept it and told General Pei that she was willing to sacrifice for him and change herself. Thus, she ruined her own martial skills and broke her own legs. With that, she basically destroyed her own wings to tie herself to General Pei's side. General Pei didn't abandon her to her own devices and kept her around to take care of her, but he never intended to marry her. General Xuanji's wish was never fulfilled, and so she killed herself out of resentment. Not for anything else, but just so General Pei would be sad. However, pardon my bluntness, the way he spoke had always been polite and overly calm. That would never happen." Shailian rubbed his forehead and didn't speak, thinking to himself, "Who the heck are these people?" General Pei Jr. continued, I don't know the right and wrong of all this either. I only know that if General Xuanji was willing to let go, things wouldn't have to be this way. Your Highness, I will take my leave now." Shalian also cupped his hands and sent them off. Nanfeng commented, "Weirdos." Shalian thought he himself was the laughingstock of the Three Realms, an infamous weirdo, so he'd best not comment on anyone else. This was something between General Pei and Xuanji, so for bystanders, there was no point in discussing who was right or wrong. Their sympathies only went out to all 17 of those innocent brides, and the military officials and sedan drivers who escorted them, but suffered a terrible fate for no reason. Having brought up the subject of the brides, Shalian instantly turned his gaze to look and saw that the 17 corpses of the brides had started to show various stages of deterioration. Some had already dissolved into white bones, while some were starting to rot, emitting waves of foul odor. The stench roused the people lying on the ground, and they gradually came to. But when they saw the scene, they jumped in shock and terror once more. Shalian used this opportunity to nag at them to spread the philosophy of good and bad karma, advising them to pray a lot for each of the brides once they went back down the mountain, and to think of a way to contact the families of those brides to come and collect their corpses. He also cautioned that they must never commit the same deeds as those corpse sellers, and they shouldn't commit any wrongdoings either. After such a thrilling night, and with the lead investigator gone, no one else dared to speak against Shalian. They each acknowledged him apprehensively, all of them feeling like they'd just had a nightmare. Only then did they realize they had acted as if possessed. Why were their minds filled only with money when there were so many dead people around? Thinking back, they all found it horrifying. The night before, everyone was doing the same thing, relying on the fact that their numbers were great and they had a leader, and they all rushed in without thinking. Now that they harbored fear in their minds, they very earnestly repented and prayed for blessings. The day hadn't yet broken. Fearing that there might be wolves and others stirring up trouble, even though Nanfeng had just run a huge circle around the whole mountain, he now had to lead this large group of people back down. He didn't complain, however, and arranged with Shalian to discuss afterwards what was to be done with the forest of upside-down corpses. When the bandaged boy woke up, he sat next to Xiaoying's corpse once more, hugging her, not saying a word. And so, Shalian also sat down next to him. He spent a while coming up with a script, but just as he was about to speak to comfort him, Shalian suddenly noticed that the boy's head was bleeding. If it was blood from the corpse forest, then it would have dried. But this blood was still dripping, so it could only be from an injury. Right then, Shalian told him, "Your head is wounded. Take off your bandages and let me have a look." That boy slowly looked up, and those bloodshot eyes glanced at him like he was scared and hesitant. Shalian smiled gently. "Don't be afraid. If there's a wound, then it must be dressed. I promise I won't be scared off by you." The boy hesitated for a moment, then turned around, and circle by circle he slowly unwrapped the bandages. His movements were very slow, but Shalian waited for him patiently, and was already pondering the issues that would come after. This boy for sure can't stay on Mount Yujun anymore, but where can he go? He can't come back to the heavens with me, and I don't even know where my next meal is coming from. I'll have to think of a reliable way to settle him. And the green ghost, gee wrong. Just then, the boy finished removing the bandages and turned around, and just as Shalian saw that face in its entirety, he felt like all the blood in his veins had drained completely.